Buon pomeriggio a tutti e bentornati. Iniziamo la sessione pomeridiana della prima giornata del convegno dopo la mattinata che è stata intensa e direi scoppiettante. Il primo intervento del pomeriggio sarà quello di James McGlew. Welcome. James McGlew è professore di Classics alla Rutgers University nel New Jersey, è uno dei più importanti storici dell'antichità e si è occupato di cultura, politica e storia delle istituzioni. In particolare ricordiamo i suoi studi sul concetto e la pratica di cittadinanza nell'Atene democratica. Ci parla oggi, il titolo del suo intervento è Dicaeopolis Democracy, What Political Wisdom Can Athenian Comedy Offer Us Now?
Grazie. In the early evening of August 4th, 2022, a flash thunderstorm hit Washington, D.C. 4 people who were touring the White House gardens collected together under a tree to escape the sudden downpour. It was not a good move. Lightning struck the tree they were standing under, and 3 of the 4 were instantly killed, including an older couple from Wisconsin who were visiting the White House on a retirement trip. Thunder from the deadly strike was heard inside the White House Oval Office, where just at that moment, a small group of historians was meeting with the US President Biden to talk about a slightly less immediate, but in their minds, much graver danger than lightning and thunder. The threat to democracy from political divisiveness, political violence, and emerging authoritarianism in the US and the world. That democracy is at threat is now a virtual cliche. This was not news to Biden. He hears it. We hear it all the time from all political directions, most clearly from the liberal left, including Biden's historians, who believe that the law is becoming a matter of indifference, and from the populist right, who claim and actually seem to believe that the elite is subverting the simple, clear will of the majority. In this context, that is, from a widespread belief in the US, in Italy, and elsewhere, that collective government stands at an apocalyptic edge, I wonder if 5th century BCE Athens can provide just a little bit of help. I say this as a classicist, of course, but I do not want to suggest the Athenians of the 5th century own democracy just because it was their word. Let's beware the fallacy of original intent. Any comparative study is explorative and probative, and historians know and have an obligation to remind others, I'm especially thinking of the American legal community, that finding imperatives over contemporary existence in dead people's lives in writings is very often a self-interested illusion. At the same time, it does seem right. It does seem to be the right time for academics or anyone else no longer to sit on the sidelines. And in that spirit, I suggest that we reconsider old comedy, and especially the character of Dicaeopolis, the comic hero of Aristophanes' first surviving work, Acarnanians. So then my question, what does Dicaeopolis, who comes from nowhere to establish peace for himself and his family with Athens' enemies, and thoroughly enjoys that peace, offer us now? There are several caveats I should state at the start of this exploration. They are important in themselves and they'll guide the paper. The first is the comedy, as I understand it, is not ideology or political rhetoric in a more palatable form. And the second is that searching for political cultural meaning for ourselves in Aristophanes' comedy does not mean that we make it more palatable for us or dumb down our own very serious and very different problems. Related to both points, I am not suggesting that we forego a specifically literary or dramatic exploration for a very different examination of comic reception. I'm not suggesting we try to discover or speculate what effect comedy had when it first performed, or what effect it has or might have for us today. Instead, I want to ask how comedy worked, or rather, in the case of the Acharnians, who Dicaeopolis is. My claim, let me say in advance, is that the way comedy worked is what should interest us most in our present, possibly quite grave and certainly very uncomic political moment. Comedy certainly put the Athenian political and cultural world front and center. It is all about the quotidian, the dramatic integration of the real and fantastic that's crucial for it. We will return for this, swerves more than anything to the present. Most of the named creatures who appear in Aristophanes were at that very moment alive and active. And it is clearly certain that Aristophanes takes on real life issues, the war between the Athenians and the Spartans and their various allies, and after it was concluded, the deep poverty that the Athenians faced, in large part because the war ended so badly for them. More concretely still, Aristophanes had real political enemies. The political leader Cleon is the most famous. Aristophanes relentlessly attacked the notoriously militaristic leader whose policies and political methods offended much of the Athenian cultural and political elite. But he did not offer real altars to Cleon, and there is very little evidence that even very successful plays, Aristophanes' Knights is the best example, that attacked Cleon seem to have had a real world effect. Unless we decide that comedy, Aristophanes, and others did not really intend to destroy Cleon, but hoped instead to make the Athenians able to make productive use of such creatures despite their venality, self-interest, and hypocrisy, without allowing them to destroy the underlying political fabric of Athenian democracy. This seems to suggest that comedy contributed to democratic discourse in its own time as a kind of political therapy. That is, it was meant and understood to challenge social and political divisiveness and to appeal to the diverse audience that it had, that we are all in this together. This can't be totally wrong. Comedies often end with some reference to the collective celebration that followed the performances, to which everyone was invited, and some plays staged rituals of renewals that symbolically restored the citizen body to a healthier and more cohesive state. Knights is again an example. At the close of that play, a newly repentant Demos is boiled clean of his former political sins. Yet I think there may be more to it than this, more than outing self-interested leaders who parade pompously as if somehow they were more noble than other Athenians. To this end, I turn to my second point, that to get the most out of comedy, we should consider how it works and not so much its reception or effect. Aristotle's Politics tells us that among the many differences between comedy and tragedy, tragedy was the imitation of action and comedy the imitation of character. In particular, the character of the philautoroi. Philautoroi, the lower, as it's usually translated, are the people in response to whom Aristotle thought it was appropriate to laugh. What Aristotle does not say about comedy, and possibly because the relevant part of the Poetics is missing, is that Aristophanic comedy explores the two very different kinds of character, the real and unreal, both of which are unknown in tragedy. Of course, tragedy shied from actual contemporary figures of cultural or political status, like Socrates, Euripides, Cleon, and Lamachus, who is Dicaeopolis' antagonist in the Acharnians. Fans of tragedy will respond that Aeschylus comfortably pulled real-life Persians into tragedy, but the exception here seems to prove the rule. As we clearly say from the sculptural program of the Athenian Parthenon, the war between the Greeks and the Persians had near mythological status for the Athenians. Aeschylus' Xerxes in that sense is no more real or about real life than is Sophocles' Oedipus. But the second kind of comic character, Dicaeopolis is our example, is perhaps more significant. If Aristotle was right that comedy pursued character, Dicaeopolis, the lead character of Acarnians, seems especially intriguing. I pause a few minutes just to review the play. The Acarnians, produced during the first decade of the Peloponnesian War, is among other things a play about war and peace. Dicaeopolis, a citizen of Athens, shows up at the Pnyx, where the popular assembly meets, determined to make that assembly about the war. Dicaeopolis wants a truce. He has no luck. The war, the Acarnian shows, is making too many Athenians rich. No one wants to talk about peace. Dicaeopolis is utterly frustrated by this, his own one conventional attempt at politics. But he does have the good fortune to meet at the assembly a character named Amphithyus, who shows up at the assembly looking for travel money to get to Sparta to negotiate for peace. Amphithyus is equally frustrated. He is a god, not a man, and certainly not an Athenian citizen. So he's told he has no right to address the assembly. But Dicaeopolis is willing to give him travel money and determines to negotiate his own peace treaty with Sparta and their allies. This happens easily enough, but Dicaeopolis soon discovers a huge obstacle to his plan to enjoy a separate peace. This is the chorus of Acarnians coming from a large village just outside the protection of the city walls. They are very anti-Spartan and have suffered tremendously from the Spartans' annual forays into the unprotected areas of Attica. And they're enraged that anyone would negotiate with Sparta. Dicaeopolis for them is a traitor, and they want to treat him accordingly. At their first appearance, the paradox of the play, they limp onto stage screaming and throwing rocks at Dicaeopolis. Dicaeopolis forces them to listen by grabbing a piece of charcoal. Charcoal production was a leading industry in the village of Acarni, and treating it as if it were the Acarnians' precious newborn child. He threatens to stab it if the chorus won't hear him out. Dicaeopolis can speak, the chorus concedes, but he must hold his head over a block primed to be chopped. Dicaeopolis agrees, but insists on wearing the most miserable of beggar outfits, which he runs to Euripides to borrow. The entire scene is a parody of Euripides' lost play, Telephus. In any case, when he returns and presents his case, he is able to persuade half the chorus that Sparta is not the true enemy, but rather the rich who profit from the war. The victory is significant but partial. The still unconvinced half of the chorus run to get a champion to present their case. This is the comic version of the real General Lamachus, a blustering, pompous figure whose class pretensions doom him to a complete and utter defeat against the clever Dicaeopolis, who appears to be a beggar but shows that he is a genuine Athenian citizen underneath his borrowed costume. Okay, there's much that is politically intriguing to help us understand Athens and possibly ourselves in Dicaeopolis' victory and the separate peace Dicaeopolis enjoys as a result. But perhaps most interesting of all and most significant for us is his very character. With that claim, I return to the makeup of the remarkable Dicaeopolis. Dicaeopolis is obviously without any mythological substance or history. The audience has not seen him before, even on the Athenian stage, and certainly not in the streets of Athens. Dicaeopolis seems to work as a 5th century Athenian name, but it's worth noting that Aristophanes has picked one we haven't otherwise heard of. And as far as we know, the Acarnians audience hadn't either. In fact, his name does not seem to matter. The audience hears it just a few times in the course of the play and relatively late. They do not hear it in any other way. The Athenians do not get programs from ushers on their way into the theater of Dionysus. They do not see a cast of characters that started with Dicaeopolis, a man of Athens of no particular merit. In fact, Aristophanes really gives no information about his character. The Athenians knew each other by knowing their father, their village, the social and economic status they had, their friends, and their personal history. But nothing of that is in the play. If then it is right to see Dicaeopolis as something made, something invented, indeed as a dramatic fiction, we must realize that the audience is intimately engaged in his making. To put this in terms that will require explanation, I suggest we frame his invention as a complex negotiation of sameness and difference that is performed on stage between Dicaeopolis himself and his audience at the very start of the prologue, when the hero sits alone in the stage assembly, chatting up the audience in an imaginary conversation. It will be a few minutes before the audience learns about Dicaeopolis' grand vision. At the start, it's up to Dicaeopolis and an engaged audience to create some relationship. Dicaeopolis initiates this conversation by referencing his many recent political and cultural likes and dislikes, his delight at Cleon's recent legal troubles, his disappointment at watching Theognis take Aeschylus's place. Dexatheos, on the other hand, was a delight, he says, but hearing Kyrus was an absolute torture. It does not matter who these people are so much, or what it might mean to like or to hate them. And probably it does not matter if Dicaeopolis articulates his maker's views, or if the discussion was calculated to resonate with the majority of the audience. Scholars have different ideas about this. I want to suggest that it's the wrong question to try and identify the biases here. The point, I think, is not to give Dicaeopolis an aesthetic or political identity in place of the social or economic identity he lacks. The opening gambit invokes opinions and examples of Schadenfreude on subjects on which his audience would also have had opinions, though not the same ones. He does not want to seem to think just like any or all of them, or for that matter, distinctly from any or all of them. Aristophanes instead wants to convince them to think of Dicaeopolis as their fellow Athenian citizen, just because, like them, he watches and participates in Athenian cultural and political life. They will soon see that he too has a family and a deme and Athenian ancestors, and they can imagine then that he has gone through many of the same initiations and rites of passages that they have. But what is primary is that he speaks with each of them. Whether they all share his views, some views, or none of them, doesn't matter. What does matter is that they each listen to him as if in a conversation. That is, as if each of them was actually answering him and each other. And it is certainly possible that members of the Athenian audience might have been shouting out a few of their own views while Dicaeopolis was presenting his. Of course, the opening scene of Cardians does more than animate Dicaeopolis as an equal. It also transports the audience into the Pnyx so that they can feel that they are part of the assembly sitting with Dicaeopolis just as he waits for everyone else to show up. I'm suggesting that it's only possible for the audience to join him in the assembly and then follow him in his utterly fantastic political quest if they imaginatively join with him in manufacturing him as an equal. In this, they have to decide that his opinions matter, that he has views, whatever they are, just as they do themselves. Dicaeopolis speaks, the audience hears him, and I think they virtually hear themselves in response, telling him and each other their own views on recent political and cultural events. So as individuals in a group as diverse but together, they participate in, essentially they authorize his special fictionality. This is of a very particular kind. Dicaeopolis does not become a family member, a simple second self, a friend, or even a neighbor. He is not someone that the audience needs to admire or even like. This interaction must be successful for the play to work. That is, for the audience to feel a connection to Dicaeopolis' extraordinary good fortune. If it does work, a comic space comes to exist that Dicaeopolis and the audience occupy. This is a space defined by an equality of shared hope and possibility that is politically meaningful and dramatically effective, not despite, but because of the imaginative engagement that establishes it. Soon we see how this connection progresses. No sooner has Dicaeopolis established a bond than he begins to charm the audience, first with his cleverness and then with his success. He encounters and converts, as I said, half the chorus of Carnian farmers to his view that the Athenian rich, not the Spartans, are the people's real enemy. Next, he defeats a comic version of the real general Lamachus, who leads the chorus's more recalcitrant half. And finally, with the full support of the converted chorus, he goes on to enjoy the fantastic benefits of his separate and singular peace with Sparta. Just as we believe that the audience followed this trajectory with enthusiasm and delight, we have to know and notice and remember that the audience had a real connection to Lamachus and what he represents. Most of the Athenians clearly have supported the war and have acquiesced as a real political body deliberating and voting in the real pnyx to the terrible risks and also sacrifice that the war entailed. Whether Aristophanes meant to convince the audience to become more critical of its leaders and possibly even to force them to find a way to end the war, or whether he believed that the Athenians, whatever their situation, should not forget to dream of peace, is a crucial question, but also one that I want to leave aside right now. As important as old comedy was as a form of social criticism, the still greater contribution I think it makes and can make now lies in the conception of equality, of making equals, that the work embeds into its very dramatic core. Dicaeopolis becomes an everyman that the audience can follow and celebrate. His extraordinary achievement, a city of peace, emerges out of an equality that he negotiates with his audience. So he becomes a comic version of someone who might by chance sit nearby them at the pnyx, speak or vote with or against them, and whose vote counts every bit as much as theirs. We are all fully aware of the enormous gulf that separates us from the Athenians and their democracy, not least in defining who is and who is not equal. And no one could possibly expect Dicaeopolis or his maker to be invited to the White House. Though indifference to law and civility, I'm embarrassed to say, seems to have helped Donald Trump get his invitation to the White House. Yet we can still appreciate comedy's intimacy with everyday political life and heed its lesson that the first task of democracy is understanding, creating, and maintaining practices of equality. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor McGlew, for these stimulating papers. And thanks to Francesco Morosi for his very short translation for Italian scholars and students of your paper.
I hope to make justice to your paper. Giusto proprio 2 minuti di riassunto in italiano di quello che ha detto il professor McGlew, che è partito naturalmente da una questione molto pressante per il nostro tempo, che poi alla fine diciamo è la questione che abbiamo discusso fin qui oggi, cioè il problema della democrazia e della sua definizione all'interno di un discorso pubblico. Anche oggi la democrazia è sotto attacco e le sue forme e le sue istituzioni sono in discussione, per non dire a rischio, e l'approccio del professor McGlew ci domanda che cosa possiamo imparare noi dalla commedia antica rispetto a questa messa in discussione della democrazia come forma di convivenza, di vita di comunità. Allora l'esempio che lui prende in considerazione è quello di Dicaeopoli, sicuramente almeno uno dei più notevoli fra gli eroi comici di Aristofane, che sono tutti per natura molto notevoli, ma insomma Dicaeopoli lo è in particolare. Il professore lo ha analizzato non tanto in relazione ad un'idea, come dire, di ricezione della commedia, ma proprio per capire qual è la finalità e la funzione che la commedia attica e quella di Aristofane in particolare aveva. Qui ha detto una cosa che io condivido molto, cioè, e che abbiamo anche anticipato questa mattina nell'introduzione fatta da Guido, cioè la commedia antica aveva un impatto tutto sommato limitato sulla effettiva vita politica ateniese. Ci siamo spinti fino a dire che l'arte, cioè che ci dimostra proprio il caso di Aristofane che l'arte ha un effetto, un impatto tutto sommato limitato sulla realtà. E quindi diciamo un modo più proficuo per capire la commedia antica e gli acarnesi insieme a lei è quello di leggerla come una forma di terapia politica, cioè un contributo al discorso pubblico. Questa è un'altra idea molto importante, secondo me, certamente per la commedia, forse io direi anche per la tragedia. Qui si è parlato anche di Demos, che ringiovanisce, cioè viene proprio guarito simbolicamente in una commedia di Aristofane. E l'idea è proprio quella di, non so se depurare, ma certamente di chiarire il discorso pubblico, dando un contributo effettivo. Allora chi è Dicaeopoli? Di nuovo, questa è un'altra cosa, è un altro apporto che sono contento di sentire da uno storico. Cioè dobbiamo dimenticarci che Dicaeopoli possa essere un personaggio storico o anche che possa essere l'allegoria di un personaggio storico. Dicaeopoli è un personaggio del tutto fittizio e il suo valore sta proprio nel fatto che è un personaggio di fiction, di finzione, che non è un personaggio reale e forse neanche realistico. Eppure naturalmente noi ce lo troviamo all'inizio della commedia che fa quello che ogni ateniese fa, cioè si presenta in assemblea, aspetta che arrivino i concittadini e poi comincia a sostenere delle opinioni su tutti gli aspetti più tipici della vita di comunità ateniese, gli autori teatrali, gli indirizzi politici e sociali della città, eccetera. Ora, le opinioni di Dicaeopoli sono le opinioni di qualcuno in particolare? In questa prima scena sono le opinioni del poeta, ma forse non interessa, dice giustamente il professore. Più che altro, diciamo, interessa proprio la costruzione attraverso queste opinioni di Dicaeopoli come di un everyman ateniese, cioè come di un personaggio del tutto fittizio che però ha una attinenza con la vita pubblica ateniese. L'invenzione dell'eroe comico procede, dice Jim, attraverso una negoziazione continua di somiglianze e differenze del personaggio rispetto ai suoi spettatori, di cui appunto negoziazione aggiungerei io di tanti aspetti, anche di aspetti esistenziali in alcune commedie, nel caso degli acarnesi naturalmente soprattutto di somiglianze e differenze in termini di apporto alla vita politica. Quindi Dicaeopoli è il tipico concittadino che gli ateniesi potevano effettivamente avere a fianco. Allora, dove vuole arrivare? Dove vogliono arrivare gli acarnesi? Vogliono arrivare, secondo il professor McGlew, alla costruzione di uno spazio comune, uno spazio di discussione, cioè costruendo un personaggio che è al tempo stesso fittizio e però credibilmente ateniese, gli acarnesi costruiscono una dimensione in cui ciò che verrà detto nella commedia sarà effettivamente un apporto effettivo ed efficace al discorso politico ateniese. Naturalmente questo ci lascia con un grande interrogativo che il professore non ha sciolto e che forse noi lo costringeremo a sciogliere, o almeno su cui lo costringeremo a darci un'opinione, cioè appunto una volta costruito questo spazio, che cosa dice Aristofane? Quali sono le sue posizioni, no? E con quali strategie le fa pervenire al suo pubblico. Però diciamo, questo inquadramento è veramente un inquadramento molto prezioso e ripeto, secondo me è molto prezioso in particolare che venga da uno storico, La commedia antica è anzitutto uno spazio simbolico, metaforico, dove il discorso è sempre necessariamente un discorso pubblico. Ecco, direi basta.
Grazie Francesco per questo riassunto in italiano che I confirm it was very respectful of your presentation. as long as your paper, but so it can be clear to our audience and students. And lasciamo lo spazio per la discussione. We'll have some questions after the other papers. And lascio la parola al professor David Carter. Professor David Carter è professore di Classics presso la Reading University, UK, e al Dipartimento di Classics, che se non sbaglio dirige, e tra i fondatori dell'International Network sull'eredità del pensiero politico greco. E i suoi interessi di ricerca si concentrano sul pensiero politico greco e sul dramma greco. In particolare, nei suoi lavori, Carter si è impegnato a indagare i modi in cui la tragedia greca può eventualmente essere interpretata come una forma politica di arte. Il titolo del suo intervento è molto evocativo: Tragic Freedoms.
Grazie. Thank you very much. Marvelous.
Okay.
Does Greek tragedy tell us anything about freedom? A good place to start is the scene in Euripides' Suppliants, where King Theseus of Athens engages in debate with a Theban herald. In the first place, Theseus promotes Athens as the home of political freedom. There is no tyrant in Athens, he says. This city is free and ruled by no one man. He also promotes personal freedoms, saying that democracy, unlike tyranny, poses no threat to private wealth or to the integrity of the family. But this speech is relatively unusual in Greek tragedy in the bold presentation of these claims. If we want to uncover ideas of freedom across the tragic corpus, it helps to look under the surface. We need to consider how characters on the tragic stage behave. We can also think about shared values. These in turn may help us to understand the values shared by members of tragedy's original audience. Part of the reason for this is the political landscape of the dramas themselves. Very nearly all of the plays we have are not set in the world of their original audience, but in a remote heroic past. Tragic poets are certainly not afraid to bring the politics of their plays up to date. We've just seen this in Euripides' Suppliants. But political anachronism in tragedy can take many forms. A tragic play is as likely to be set against the background of tyranny as democracy. And even a play like Suppliants mixes the heroic with the contemporary. Theseus has given power to the people, but he did so from his position as king. The precise political context is individual to each drama, and it must be understood on its own terms. We find out about the political context gradually as the drama progresses. Maurizio Giangiulio gave a good illustration of this with reference to Aeschylus' Suppliants in his paper this morning. The other reason that we must look under the surface, which is more relevant to my talk today, is the domestic setting of many of the dramas. Since the 450s BC at the latest, tragedy made use of a stage building that stood behind the performers facing the audience. This stage building could represent a tent or military headquarters, a temple or shrine, but most often someone's house or palace. Within this house, we should expect to find a family, and perhaps an extended household, male and female, young and old, slave and free. Tragedy is an unusual genre within Greek literature in its balanced portrayal of all these categories. In particular, tragic poets tend to give us much time and dramatic importance to female roles as to male ones. Tragedy gives us a more socially complete account of ancient Greek life than many other literary sources, and so on one level at least, it ought to be very useful indeed to the historian. Given the domestic context of so many of the dramas, tragic freedoms are just as likely to be personal freedoms as political ones. In this paper, I will focus on personal freedoms, how people speak and act on the tragic stage, how free they really are, and how free they understand themselves to be. This in turn may shed light on ancient Greek social attitudes. However, we need to be careful if we want to make a Greek play available as source material for the ancient historian. None of the plays is an unfiltered piece of documentary evidence. To understand the plays, we have to understand their purpose, and their purpose was to entertain. Only when we have considered tragedy as drama can we consider tragedy as evidence. Now, tragedy is a representation of speech and action. So how free is tragic speech and how free is tragic action? Avanti, per favore. That one. Questo. Grazie. The rest of this paper comes in 3 parts. I shall say a few words about free speech, then at greater length freedom of movement, and then we can draw some conclusions. I should say that this paper is work in progress. Part 1 summarizes the conclusions of earlier work. Part 2 is based on a talk that I gave a few years ago but didn't take any further at the time. I'm grateful to the organizers of this conference for the opportunity to think this through again. Part 3, therefore, relates my findings to the overarching theme of this conference and draws conclusions about the usefulness of Greek tragedy as historical evidence. So, to part 1. The ancient Athenians had a reputation for free speech, a reputation that is reflected differently in different literary sources. Plato, in the Republic, describes a democratic city as full of free speech and other forms of liberty. Plato's word for free speech, parrhesia, is best understood by English speakers like myself as frankness or unrestrained speech. It literally means saying everything. For this reason, ancient Greek parrhesia is not an unqualified virtue. In at least some cases, parrhesia can be presented as a troubling quality, a tendency to talk too much. There are several examples in tragedy where the ability to speak has to be negotiated. Next slide, please. Thank you. In this scene from Euripides' Bacchae, the herdsman has returned to Thebes from Mount Kithyron, where the women of the city have gone, driven mad by the god Dionysus. He is prepared to give a full account to King Pentheus of events on Mount Kithyron, saying everything, but he hesitates to do so. He says, I want you to tell me whether I should speak with parrhesia about what has happened there, or be circumspect in my speech. I fear your mind's hastiness, my lord, its irascibility, and your all too royal temper. Pentheus, in reply, assures the herdsman that he will not be blamed or punished. Michel Foucault described this as a parrhesiastic contract. This was a time-limited contract in which one more powerful figure allowed freedom of speech to another less powerful figure. In other words, there is a quasi-legal relationship between the two characters in each scene. This is as close as we get in tragedy to free speech as a legal right. But it is a short-lived right guaranteed by a temporary agreement. The underlying position is one of inequality and the assumed inability of the socially inferior figure to say what they want. On this analysis, free speech is connected to social status. To be sure, not every encounter between figures of different social class in tragedy is governed in this way. In fact, examples of the parrhesiastic contract are confined almost exclusively to Euripides. But there is evidence here to suggest that parrhesia, the complete freedom to speak, was associated with higher social status. Next slide, please. What about Athens, where everybody is theoretically, and as we've just heard, equal? Well, the association of free speech with social status seems to apply in Athens too, certainly as described in Euripides. When in the Ion, the title figure wonders aloud who his birth parents might be, he says he hopes they are Athenian because this would guarantee him the ability to speak with parousia. Next slide, please. And in the Hippolytus, Phaedra is anxious that her personal shame as the lover of her own stepson may dent the reputation of her family back in Athens. Speaking to the chorus of local women, she says, "My friends, it is this very purpose that is bringing about my death, that I may not be convicted of bringing shame to my husband or to the children I gave birth to, but rather that they may live in glorious Athens as free men, free of speech and flourishing, enjoying good repute where their mother is concerned." Phaedra understands free speech of Athens to be the property not just of citizens, but of citizens in good standing. Personal reputation seems to matter as much as civic entitlement. Next slide, please. Turning now to part 2 of my paper. I want to know if social status has the same effect on freedom of movement as it sometimes does on tragic free speech. I shall consider the movement especially of women in tragedy, and here I mean women who are not slaves, the wives and daughters of free men. I'm especially interested in the first entrance that a woman makes from the stage building in any given play, and how self-consciously this move is made. There are several places where such an entrance seems to need an explanation, as if walking out onto the street is not a normal thing to do. Next slide, please. As an example, here is Medea in Euripides' play, appearing from the house for the first time and addressing the chorus of Corinthian women. We've already heard a good deal about Medea in the prologue, and heard a lot from her too in offstage cries. It is a simple matter of tragic stagecraft that the audience cannot see for themselves anything that's going on in the building. So if Medea wants to make a proper speech, she must come outside. There are 2 reasons that Medea leaves the house. The first concerns the audience in the theatre, who cannot see her if she remains indoors. The second concerns Medea's audience on stage, a group of Corinthian women who she will later describe as her social equals. The explanation she gives for leaving the house is the sense of shame she would feel if she kept herself apart. She says, "I have come out of the house lest you should find fault with me, for I know that though many mortals are haughty, both in private and in public, others get a reputation for indifference to their neighbours from their retiring manner of life." These lines give a plausible reason that Medea would want to come out of the house. They also begin to establish the relationship between Medea and the chorus. She wants to present herself as one of them in order to gain their trust. The first lines that she gives on stage do not only serve to cover her entrance, but are also closely woven into the drama. By the way, this scene is also interesting for the way in which Medea deploys the concept of shame, which we'll be hearing a bit more in a bit. In other examples, which I'll discuss presently, shame is an inhibiting factor that might prevent a woman from going outdoors. In this example, shame is what draws Medea out of the house and into female company in the city. This trick of creating a plausible reason to bring a female character out of the house and weaving it into the drama is used in different ways by Euripides in the Hippolytus. When Phaedra, sick with love for Hippolytus, comes out of the house and onto stage, it is because she thinks the open air will make her feel better. But the scene that follows between Phaedra and the nurse might more naturally have taken place indoors. It's really a domestic scene that has been translated to the outside. Next slide, please. The outdoor setting for all tragic dialogue reflects the nature of the performance space. Modern dramas can be set indoors in a way that feels natural because the audience itself is indoors and under a roof. Ancient Greek drama, by contrast, was an open-air form of entertainment, staged in front of what by our standards were very big audiences. Audience members towards the back of the seating area may have looked down on the roof of the stage building. It would have been hard, I would argue, to pretend to the audience that they were watching something going on indoors. Nor was there any need to make this pretense. There were two ways in which a skilled dramatist and talented actors could bring the indoors outdoors. The first was the use of messenger speeches, which could include vivid detail captured from within the house, taking the audience member inside each room in their mind's eye. The second, as we've begun to see, was to find plausible reasons to stage a scene outside that might normally have occurred inside. These scenes do not take place a long way outdoors, but in the immediate vicinity of the house. The use of the space in front of the house as an extension of domestic space reflects an obvious tension that runs through many of the more political plays. This is a tension, in other words, between public and private, between civic life and domestic life. So is there any pattern to the way in which female entrances from the stage building are presented in tragedy? Next slide, please. As a starting point, I will present an overview of the first entrances of women in Greek tragedy as far as I can tell. The staging of tragedy assumes something like this schematic diagram of the performance space. And by the way, it's likely that the 5th century theatrum was rectangular and not semicircular, but that doesn't matter for my argument today. The performance space offers 3 routes onto stage. The first is through a door in the center of the stage building. The second is through either of the aesidoi at the side of the performance space. In tragedies set in cities, these aesidoi can be imagined as leading further into the town or into the open countryside and beyond. And the third way into the action is above the stage building, either by climbing onto the roof or, if you happen to be a god, by being suspended above it. Next slide, please. If we survey the first entrances of women compared to men, we get the following results. Of married men in extant tragedy, 15% make their first appearance from the stage building. Of unmarried women and boys, so unmarried men and boys, 20%. Of married women, 77% make their first appearance from the stage building, and of unmarried women, 78%. Now, I should say a few words of methodology. Firstly, I've only looked at first entrances and not re-entrances. I don't have any time today to discuss the interactions of women with other characters once they've established themselves on stage. Second, any results that we have are conditioned by the availability of evidence. We only have 31 complete plays to consider, and within this example, Euripides is disproportionately represented. Third, I've accepted Oliver Taplin's view that since no drama before the Oresteia trilogy appears to make use of a stage building, we can date its building to the 450s. For this reason, I've excluded the earlier surviving plays of Aeschylus from my survey. Fourth, I've included speaking characters only, and I've excluded slaves and also characters with special roles, including priests and heralds. Finally, there are no stage directions in the text, and so it is sometimes a matter of judgment whether an entrance is made from the stage building or somewhere else. Notwithstanding these caveats, we can see a clear and unsurprising pattern. This pattern becomes even clearer if we consider only those plays where the stage building represents someone's house or palace. Next slide, please. Female characters are much more likely than male characters to enter from the house, and the exceptions to this rule are telling in itself. Next slide, please. There are the exceptions. Clytemnestra in Euripides' Electra is the co-tyrant of Argos, visiting her impoverished daughter from the city. Agave in the Bacchae is one of the citizen women of Thebes who have been driven mad and sent out of doors by the god Dionysus. Cassandra is an outsider who's been taken back to Greece by the victorious Agamemnon. So those are the only 3 that I can see in this kind of play that enter from the side rather than the house. The appearance of married women from the house is explained differently in different plays. We've already considered the examples of Medea and Phaedra. Electra in Euripides' play of that name comes out of the house carrying a water jar so that she can visit the local well, a behaviour that is easily explained in terms of her lower social status. A very different example, which you can see on the screen, is Clytemnestra in Aeschylus's Libation Bearers. When Orestes, pretending to be a stranger, knocks on her door, he expects to be answered either by the man or the woman of the house. He says he would prefer to speak to the man because the conversation would not be conditioned by the sense of shame that comes with meeting a strange woman. He says it would be more fitting for a man to come. When there's bashfulness in a conversation, it makes what is said obscure. A man speaking to a man is confident and uses words that reveal his meaning clearly. Now, the word that's been described with the quaint English word bashfulness is the Greek word eidos. And in conversation, this word, as we have seen, key to our understanding of ancient Greek free speech. Put simply, the less a person is inhibited by shame, the more likely he or she is to speak with parrhesia. Next slide, please. We now turn to consider the entrances of unmarried women from the house. I can find 9 such cases in the surviving plays. One of these is a non-Greek example, the prophetess Thyone, who emerges from her brother Theoclymenus' house during the action of Euripides' Helen. The other 8 examples, which we can look at in reasonable detail, are spread across 5 plays, 1 by Aeschylus and 2 each by Sophocles and Euripides. The first example is from Aeschylus' Libation Bearers, and it presents a plausible circumstance under which an unmarried woman would walk out of the house and into the public spaces of the city. Electra is leaving the house in order to pour libations, rather like this woman depicted on an early 5th century drinking vessel. Next slide, please. On seeing the chorus members, Electra among them, Orestes says, "Will I be right in conjecturing that these women are bringing drink offerings for my father to propitiate the powers below? It can be nothing else, because I think I see my sister Electra coming with them, striking in her bitter grief." We know that women could have a significant role in public religious observance. We know of religious festivals in which only women could take part. Aristophanes, in his Women at the Thesmophoria, goes as far as to present one such festival in ways that mimic the political proceedings of men. A comic fantasy, surely, but the underlying set of assumptions is that women could assemble publicly for religious observance. Electra in the Libation Bearers is doing just that as one of a group of mourners. Next slide, please. The second example from the Antigone is interesting for the way in which Sophocles deploys dramatic space. This example is taken from the very beginning of the play. No chorus has entered, and the 2 women, Antigone and Ismene, have the stage to themselves. We assume that a conversation between 2 sisters would normally take place indoors, but for reasons already given, indoor scenes cannot be presented on the tragic stage. So, Sophocles maneuvers the 2 women out of the house. The reason given is brilliant in its dramatic plausibility. Their 2 brothers have recently died fighting opposite sides in a civil war. The sisters have good reason to suspect the new regime, and so what they have to say must be said in secret. In this climate of fear, they step outside of the house and its courtyard so as not to be overheard. Ismene says, "Since the Argive army left during this night, I know nothing further, nothing that improves my fortune or brings me nearer to disaster." Antigone replies, "I knew it well, and I summoned you out of the gates of the courtyard because I wished you to hear this alone." Immediately following this scene, we see the entry of a chorus of Theban citizens, King Creon's senior advisors. The rest of the play takes place in the public spaces of the city and is dominated by male figures. The further entrances of Antigone and Ismene feel like intrusions into this political space. It is only in the prologue that space is used differently, turning the audience into eavesdroppers on a private conversation. Next slide, please. The third example from Sophocles' Electra presents a very similar relationship between the 2 sisters to the one we saw in Antigone. This time, Electra is the one to question authority, and her sister Chrysothemis tries to persuade her to mind her own business. Chrysothemis says, "What are these things that you've come out to say by the door we leave the house by, my sister? And will you not learn, after so long, not to indulge in futile fashion your useless anger?" What's interesting about this scene is the way in which Chrysothemis associates her sister's defiant behavior with her emergence from the house. Chrysothemis herself has a more conventional reason to go outside. She is carrying offerings to place at the tomb of Agamemnon. Next slide, please. In the fourth example, from Euripides' Phoenician Women, a young Antigone is led by a slave onto the roof of the house in order to satisfy her curiosity and view the Argive army led by Polynices. The most obvious thing about this passage is the degree of caution showed by the slave, who fears that Antigone will be seen by strange men in public. He says, "Antigone, since you begged your mother, she has permitted you to leave your maiden quarters and go to this outermost upper room of the house to see the Argive army. Halt there so that I can look to see whether any citizens are to be seen on the street. Blame might attach to me as a slave and to you as my mistress." This example is interesting for the sense of shame associated with contact with strangers and the excessive care taken by the slave to avoid it. Next slide, please. There are two other unmarried women who make their first entrance from the house, and both of them appear in the prologue to Euripides' Orestes. Electra probably begins this play on stage in front of the house, tending to her sick brother. No explanation is given that they are outside the house. Perhaps they're on the lookout for the arrival of Menelaus, who it is hoped will advocate them among the Argives. However, there's an obvious echo of a similar scene in Hippolytus, the one we saw before, where the nurse has taken the ailing Phaedra outside for some fresh air. Next slide, please. During this same scene, a young Hermione comes out of the house on the request of her mother Helen. Hermione's job is to take libations to the tomb of Clytemnestra. We have observed that this ought to be an unproblematic public duty, even for an unaccompanied girl. However, this sense of duty competes with Helen's sense of shame around her daughter appearing outside. When Electra encourages Helen to send Hermione, Helen replies that it's not good for unmarried girls to appear in public. Electra has her own reasons for winning this argument, but she persuades Helen that duty should come first. This scene is interesting for the way in which shared social rules can be negotiated and weighed up against other imperatives. Next slide, please. These examples reveal a fairly strong pattern which is maintained across several different dramas by three different poets. In each case, a plausible explanation is given within the drama for the movement of young women out of the house and into public space. This pattern seems less strong in the case of married women, some of whom enter from the house with no explanation at all, or even answer the door to strange men. Nor I think do we see the same pattern of behavior when it comes to groups of women. Female choruses in tragedy, which always enter from the side of the stage, arguably move with more confidence. This might just be because they're choruses and dramatic convention dictates that they appear on stage, but it may also suggest safety in numbers. The movement of young women out of the house and into public space appears to be governed by social rules, but like all rules, they're open to negotiation and interpretation. One person's idea of respectable behavior is not always the same as another's. It may appear normal for young women to stay indoors and away from strange men, but reasons can be found to break away from norms of behavior. Some of these reasons, as I have said, are dramatic reasons. Tragic poets can show a lot of skill in maneuvering female figures outside. Behind this artifice, perhaps we can pick up some shared assumptions. One of these, which is recurrent in the examples we have discussed, is a sense of shame felt on both sides when the wife or mother of a citizen meets a man from another family. There's a good example of this in Euripides' Iphigenia at Aulis, a play set in a military camp, not a town. Achilles chances upon Clytemnestra when visiting Agamemnon's tent and tries to pull out of meeting her on the grounds that this creates shame on both sides. Clytemnestra reassures him that shame should not apply in this case because Achilles is betrothed to her daughter, something she believes to be true, but which comes as news to Achilles. The ancient Greek word for shame, eidos, can be understood as the reverse of honor, Greek timē. The one word describes a loss of esteem, while the other describes the esteem in which one is or ought to be held in society. Timē also has connotations, I think, of social standing. An Athenian citizen in good standing was epitimos. A citizen who lost his citizenship was artimos. I think this helps us to understand both free speech and freedom of movement in tragedy. An ability to speak freely, as we have seen, can be closely connected to the relative social status of the speaker and listener. It is interesting how figures in tragedy, especially in Euripides, show themselves to be acutely conscious of their own standing and therefore their ability to speak freely. Equally, the freedom of movement by women in tragedy frequently comes across as a function of their social status. None of them is incapable of moving out of the house and into public space, but movements of this kind tend to be negotiated in the context of personal shame. This appears to be especially true of unmarried women. Next slide, please. The close connection of free speech and free movement to social status comes together in my final example, which is from Euripides' Andromache. Hermione in this play is presented as a recently married woman with no obvious sense of personal shame. She emerges from her palace dressed as a queen and addresses Andromache, formerly a Trojan princess, but now a slave, and she says, "The luxurious gold that adorns my head and neck and the spangled gown that graces my body, I did not bring these here as the first fruits of the house of Achilles or of Peleus. My father Menelaus gave them to me from the city of Sparta together with a large dowry, and therefore I may speak my mind. Look at me," Hermione seems to say, "and agree that I have complete freedom of speech in this place." Next slide, please. So, all of this is very interesting, but is it useful? What can drama tell us about the world of its original audience? It's time for part 3 of my paper, which is very short and in which I shall consider tragedy as evidence. Christopher Pelling, writing in the conclusion to Greek Tragedy and the Historian, remarks that, quote, "If we talk of a tragic text as evidence of the civic theatrical experience, it is like talking of a fragment of a pot as evidence for the original artifact. We begin from a part and reconstruct what we can of the whole," end quote. The application of Pelling's analogy takes some imagination, and we have to accept that we may get some of the details wrong. However, it is worth reminding ourselves of 3 points. Point 1, the texts that we have were written for a specific purpose, a performance within a dramatic festival. One assumes that to be granted a chorus to present at the Dionysia was in one respect like accepting a commission. It concentrated the poet's mind on a single occasion and the audience of a specific day. This audience was by any measure a large one and probably quite diverse, including a number of visitors from elsewhere in the Greek world. The festival was a religious occasion during which the normal business of the city was suspended. The original intended audience of these dramas was on holiday. Point 2, the subject matter of the plays was in most cases the heroic past. Tragic people are for the most part not only heroic, but elevated in social status, usually royal or aristocratic. In a well-known article first published in 1995, Mark Griffith described them, borrowing a phrase from Aeschylus, as brilliant dynasts. To both ancient and modern audiences, they are decidedly not like us. Nice contrast with the Dicaeopolis that we met in the previous paper. Their actions are frequently outlandish and gruesome. Point 3, the performers spoke and sang in verse. They needed to project their words to the back of a large open-air viewing space. They wore masks and outsized costumes. One wonders whether people sitting at the back of the audience picked out every word and whether this really mattered. The plays were as much a spectacle as they were entertainment for the intellect. So there's something special about tragic drama. Notwithstanding this specialness, one assumes that the performances had to be intelligible to their original audience. This audience was large enough to include a broad cross-section of Greek society. I tend to take Plato at face value when, in the Gorgias, he describes tragedy as a kind of rhetoric addressed to both a kind of rhetoric addressed to such a demos as is composed of women together with men, both slave and free. Although the majority in the audience were doubtless Athenian citizens, there is no evidence that other members of the household were prevented from attending. There are two moves we can make in the consideration of tragic freedoms. First, while the political context of a drama was something that could be created and explained within each play, the underlying values were less changeable. This is because they had to be intelligible to a popular audience. Second, and notwithstanding the first point, issues of personal freedom are not always underlying in the drama. They sometimes rise to the surface. They are contestable and contested. For this reason, I've been careful not to give a definitive position on the position of women in ancient Greek society, and especially their freedom of movement beyond their own home. Instead, I've suggested that the movement of women is subject to social rules, which in turn reflect underlying values. Greek tragedy reveals what some of these rules are and how they can be negotiated. More broadly, we have seen that tragic people are sometimes worried about their status in society. Issues of personal freedom are mapped onto these issues of status. Greek tragedy is a rich source of evidence for the historian as long as we remember to treat it first and foremost as drama. Consideration of the dramatic merits of any play, the deployment of entrances and exits, the character and motivation of each figure on stage can help us to look under the surface and consider the deeper set of assumptions that may have been shared between poets and the audience. I hope to have given some examples today of how this might work.
Thank you so much, Professor Carter, also for the respect of the time and for your so stimulating presentation about such important topic as like freedom and with a lot of examples from different texts. Thank you so much. And also for your presentation, Francesco Morosi will give a short, a short translation, yes, in Italian for our students. Thank you.
Prometto di essere molto breve. Il paper del professor Carter affronta un tema piuttosto grande, che è la libertà in tragedia, da tutti i punti di vista. Naturalmente il problema, la prospettiva da cui la osserva lui è la prospettiva di uno storico, cioè un problema grossissimo, in che modo e in che senso il teatro antico può essere usato come fonte per capire effettivamente come funzionassero le cose nella società ateniese. Naturalmente quando parliamo di libertà parliamo di un concetto molto ampio che il professore ha declinato in almeno due sensi. Da una parte la libertà di parola, la cosiddetta parresia, e dall'altra, quella su cui ha poi speso più tempo, la libertà di movimento. Quanto alla libertà di parola, la conclusione, almeno diciamo provvisoria a cui si può giungere, è che appunto questa libertà di parola, che pure la retorica ateniese molto spesso diceva essere infinita, senza limiti, eccetera, in realtà la tragedia ci dimostra che illimitata tanto non era. Anzi, il fatto stesso che, come diceva Foucault, occorresse in diversi punti di contatto fra due personaggi arrivare a stipulare un contratto parresiastico, cioè appunto discutere questa parresia, dimostra che esisteva una disuguaglianza nella libertà di parola. Naturalmente una disuguaglianza che possiamo almeno ipotizzare correva su un rift sociale, una differenza sociale fra chi era cittadino ben rispettato e chi invece non lo era. La seconda libertà di cui abbiamo parlato è la libertà di movimento. Sembra una cosa banale, invece è tutt'altro che banale, è un problema molto grande, soprattutto a proposito dei personaggi femminili, che sono naturalmente molto numerosi nella tragedia che noi possediamo. Si possono muovere oppure no le donne? Come è noto, appunto, molte altre fonti ci testimoniano di una sorta persino di reclusione femminile. Eppure molti personaggi femminili in scena si muovono e come, escono di casa e come. Allora, naturalmente molte spiegazioni possono essere trovate per questo. Certamente c'è anche una questione di convenzione drammaturgica. Il professore lo ha sottolineato più volte. Se si vuole rappresentare qualche cosa bisogna per forza che le donne escano dalla schienè. Questo lo diceva già Pat Easterling in risposta a un articolo molto discusso e discutibile di Shaw negli anni 70, The Female Intruder, l'intrusora femminile. Naturalmente poi c'è tutta una questione di reputazione sociale. Ora, il professore ci ha mostrato attraverso delle statistiche molto interessanti che la tragedia che noi possediamo è molto molto coerente nella sua messa in scena. La schienè rappresenta quasi sempre, e questo è grazie al forte valore simbolico del teatro antico, lo spazio domestico. E quindi, diciamo, l'uscita da questo spazio domestico naturalmente è sempre significativa. Abbiamo visto con le statistiche che ha fatto il professor Carter che le donne sposate e non sposate, nubili, tendono per la grandissima parte a uscire dalla schienè, cioè a essere collegate ad uno spazio domestico. Del resto poi l'immediata prospicenza, insomma l'immediato esterno della schienè è a sua volta, come dire, lo spazio domestico stesso. Le eccezioni a questa regola sono molto significative. Clitennestra nell'Elettra di Euripide, Agave nelle Baccanti e anche Cassandra nell'Orestea, che è una schiava che viene portata da Troia. No? Si tratta di donne che hanno tutte una ragione molto forte per entrare in scena, fare il loro primo ingresso in scena, non dalla schienè, cioè non dallo spazio domestico che pertiene loro. A quanto pare le donne sposate sono un po' più libere, più in generale, ma insomma, come dobbiamo interpretare questo fenomeno e soprattutto quale impatto questo ha sull'uso documentale del teatro, in particolare a proposito di questa questione. Le ipotesi che David ha avanzato riguardano intanto il concetto di eidos, di vergogna, come si dice, contrario di una parola molto importante che è timè. La timè anche nell'Atene classica, anzi soprattutto nell'Atene classica, rappresentava anche il diritto civile, tanto è vero che chi perde i diritti civili è detto atimos. Ecco, le donne alle quali è spesso associata l'aidos, cioè la vergogna, sono atimoi a loro volta, no? E diciamo naturalmente la timè, nel senso dei diritti civili, consente anche una maggiore libertà di movimento. Vorrei dire io, che faccio una mia piccola aggiunta, anche simbolico. La libertà di movimento è un simbolo della libertà maggiore o minore che si ha. Questo però naturalmente, come dire, ci conduce a vedere delle regole sociali e dei pattern sociali abbastanza chiari. D'altro canto però ci conduce anche a osservare che i testi sono estremamente diversi, no? Abbiamo visto molti esempi che adesso non sto neanche a raccontarvi, ma questi diversi esempi ci dimostrano un trattamento non facile. Quindi diciamo, quello che lo storico è chiamato a fare nella valutazione di questi casi e quello che anche l'interprete è chiamato a fare nell'applicazione di questi casi a appunto diciamo pattern storici è quello di usare un po' di grano del cervello e capire quali sono le ragioni specifiche che la drammaturgia impone per ciascuno di questi personaggi. Ecco qua.
Grazie Francesco. Rimandiamo le domande alla fine dell'ultimo intervento, che sarà in collegamento, penso che sia forse già pronto. È il professor Paul Woodruff, filosofo, scrittore, traduttore, insegna, tanto lo presentiamo così magari lo evochiamo il collegamento Zoom. Il professor Woodruff insegna alla University of Texas, Austin. Hi, and welcome to our conference.
Thank you very much.
Il professor Woodruff si è sempre rivolto al pensiero antico, si è sempre dedicato in particolare all'opera, ha studiato a fondo l'opera di Platone, di cui ha curato l'edizione critica di diverse opere e ha indagato spesso anche l'etica e il pensiero antichi nella tragedia greca, con particolare attenzione alla tragedia di Sofocle. E il titolo della sua relazione di oggi è Theater as Democracy.
Thank you. And I've enjoyed the presentation of David Carter on freedoms, which I think connects in interesting ways with what I'm going to talk about. When I was 12 years old, I read a play that I found on my father's bookshelf. It was called Oedipus Rex. And by the way, I have sent a copy of this talk to the other participants to make it easier for you to follow me if English is not easy for you. So you're welcome to read or have the text in front of you. I think Professor Morosi could make it available to you. The play I found was called Oedipus Rex, with an introduction by Thornton Wilder, the playwright. I started to read it because I was a fan of Wilder's play, Our Town. And then the play itself, Oedipus, fascinated me. In all the early scenes, I knew things that Oedipus did not know, though he was furiously looking for the truth. I loved knowing more than he did, as all audiences do. It is delightful to watch a hero groping towards facts that we in the audience already possess. We enjoy our superior position in the audience. This knowledge trick, as I will call it, is one of the basic tools of theater, of making a play worth watching. I learned later that the Greek title of the play, given to it by ancient editors, is Oedipus Tyrannus, and that a tyrannus is not the same as a king, a basileus, or a rex in Italian. Indeed, Oedipus is a legitimate king, son of a king, but he does not know this until he has lost everything. Before that, he has the mindset of a tyrant, as Sophocles typically represents tyrants on stage, fearful of conspiracies against them and liable to threaten violence against those who might replace them. The story of Oedipus has been told in various ways, going back to the Odyssey, and it was featured in plays by Aeschylus and Euripides. But as far as we can tell, Sophocles was the only writer to endow Oedipus with the qualities of a tyrant. Why did he do this? The answer, I think, is that tyrants make great theater. In Athens, there were political reasons for showing tyrants coming to grief, and these must have influenced Sophocles. But there were and continue to be theatrical reasons for putting tyrants on stage. Even an intelligent tyrant, such as Oedipus, faces a debilitating cognitive challenge. A tyrant is terrified of losing his position, and therefore he prefers a conspiracy theory to the facts. And in the case of Oedipus, it takes him 1,200 lines in Sophocles' play to discover the truth. This long delayed discovery, a delay more than anything that I think the other playwrights created, allows Sophocles to give the audience more time to enjoy their delicious superiority over the tyrant in point of knowledge. The very nature of theater favors putting tyrants on stage, letting the audience know things the tyrants do not, and bringing them to a bad end. This was true in democratic Athens. That's no surprise. But we shall see that it is also true for theater under a tyrannical monarchy. Everywhere, anywhere, the discomfiture of tyrants makes great theater. First, the silent voting of the audience. I have said in my book on theater that the art of theater for the performer is in making human action worth watching, and the art of theater for the audience lies in finding human action worth watching. I made no general claim about what's worth watching. That's up to the vote, the silent vote of the audience. What the audience finds worth watching reveals the values of their culture. In beautiful Syracuse, side by side are the ruins of two places for theater. In the Greek theater, audiences watch plays by Aeschylus, including the Persians. In the Roman Oval, some centuries later, they watched animals die and gladiators fight. In classical times, the Syracusans loved theater so much, we're told by a later source, that they gave special favors to Athenian prisoners who could recite the latest odes from Euripides' plays. What a difference between these early Syracusans who treasured the experience of poetry and the later ones who longed to see bloodshed. The difference reflects the silent voting of the audiences involved. No one can force an audience member to pay attention, or to be amused, or be frightened, or to be filled with pity. No one can force an audience to enjoy a performance. An audience is a community in which each person's reaction counts as a kind of silent vote. Theater, in this way, is essentially a democracy in form. What about the content? Now, theater evolved for a democratic audience in Athens, in sync with the evolution of democracy there, and the popular plays often sounded democratic themes: freedom, the rule of law, the virtues of ordinary folk, compassion for the underdog, the aspirations of the poor, and fear of tyrants. The audiences in Athens were passionate about their recently won freedoms, their emergence from tyranny, their development of the people's courts, the rights of citizens to speak in the assembly, and their joy in escaping from domination by the Persians, who to their minds had enslaved their subject peoples. And of course, I must admit on the side that democracy here in ancient Athens entailed freedom for men. What it entailed for women is much more complicated, and I won't take that up here. It was very interesting hearing David Carter talk about that. So the first point was the silent voting of the audience, which is a democratic feature of any theater. The second point is about staging equality, what I call staging equality. In Athenian theater, common citizens are usually shown to be at least as good as their rulers, both morally and intellectually. The watchman in the Antigone runs rings around Creon, for example, and the various servants in Oedipus Tyrannus show not only intelligence, but a high degree of compassion. Moreover, the chorus frequently speaks with the wisdom of the common people, and in one sense, it always represents the audience, no matter what official role it has in the play. Meanwhile, powerful folk like Oedipus are often shown to be vulnerable to errors, often to self-deception. If a play is aimed at a general audience, then the production team must find a way to make that general audience feel good about itself. Staging equality is always an effective way of doing that. Of course, the knowledge trick that I mentioned earlier is also effective, letting the audience know things that the characters do not and therefore have that sense of superiority. The third point I wish to make about democratic elements endemic to theater is that it's always effective to bring a tyrant on stage and show the tyrant coming to a bad end. Now, a tyrant on stage, a stage tyrant, is not the same as an historical one. Indeed, as Thucydides shows, popular Athenian views of tyranny during the 5th century were way out of tune with the historical facts from the 6th century. Stage tyrants are characterized mainly by fear of being displaced. Oedipus is a frightening example. To every morsel of evidence against him, he responds with rage, jumping to the conclusion that those who bring up evidence against him are part of a conspiracy to overthrow him. At the same time, Oedipus is admirable in his curiosity and in his well-meaning care for the city. He is unique and not a type, and the audience does care what happens to him from the moment he makes his audacious promise to save Thebes. Now, I've said that stage tyrants are gifts to the playwright. Most of them will fall because of their overreaching and their dangerous rages and their self-deception. Public or private anger will rise against them for their rages. Ignorance will lead them into traps. Watching them fall can be excruciating for the audience, even horrifying, but it is nevertheless satisfying. This man has risen too high, and his thoughts are too big, the audience thinks. His hubris may become a source of terrible trouble to the tyrant's people, and so the sooner he falls, the better. Now, Sophocles, I think, clearly represented Oedipus as a stage tyrant, although he's not responsible for the title Oedipus Tyrannus. One piece of evidence for this, which I realize is somewhat contentious, when Socrates reports the truth about the oracle, Oedipus takes him to be conspiring against him as a tyrant would, and accuses Creon of trying to seize power. And he will sentence Creon to death for this reason. Creon answers, "No, look at yourself from my point of view and ask this question first. Do you think anyone would choose to rule in constant fear when he could sleep without quaking and have exactly the same power? Not me. Why should I want to be tyrannous? I'd be insane." Creon knows that Oedipus lives in fear day and night. But why should Oedipus, of all people, be afraid? He has enormous power. He is afraid, however, because he knows deep down that he is guilty of overreaching, and he fears that someone will call him to account. He believes that he does not quite belong in his position of power. From that fear, suspicions grow against all around him but his wife. In tyranny lies this disease, not to trust friends, as Prometheus says in the Prometheus Bound, Prometheus Victus. In the famous second stasimon of the Oedipus Tyrannus, the chorus sings, "Hubris begets the tyrant." Hubris begets the tyrant. For years, I did not understand this, and I thought a copyist must have got it backward. The tyrant begets hubris, since Oedipus did not seek to be a tyrant. That role was thrust upon him. But now I think I see what the line means. Oedipus is tyrant in Thebes only because of his breathtaking hubris in trying to defeat the oracle and so to get the better of the god Apollo by placing himself where he thought he could not kill his father or impregnate his mother. What greater hubris could there be than trying to defeat a great god? Now, the audience admires Oedipus for many reasons, but they will be relieved when Apollo wins and the tyrant falls. They had expressed great fear that Apollo would be defeated and everything divine depart. That's the last line of that stasimon, and everything divine departs. So they must rejoice at the outcome in spite of their pity for Oedipus. Apollo will be vindicated, Creon will not be executed, the plague will cease, and the dangers that grow from Oedipus' overconfidence will be defeated. Now, I've identified three democratic elements that I think are endemic to theater and are illustrated in the Oedipus Tyrannus. But it is debated as to whether Sophocles really favored democracy as a form of government. So I'll say just a little bit about this. Paul Cartledge and some others have argued that Sophocles was not a supporter of democracy in Athens because of his role in the events leading up to the rule by the 400, which was an oligarchy in the making. Cartledge may be right, I can't prove him wrong, but I contend that Sophocles' plays are not at all supportive of oligarchy. They often show common people to advantage and give no credit to aristocracy as such. Cartledge and I have had a delightful argument about this, a very friendly one, and we agreed at least that Sophocles was certainly an anti-tyrant. After all, 4 of his 7 surviving plays show tyrants looking bad for being tyrants. I would argue that Sophocles is also an anti-aristocrat. The Philoctetes illustrates brilliantly how a son can fail to inherit his father's virtue. And if virtue is not inherited, aristocracy has no justification. The son of Achilles is easily persuaded to tell a whopper of a lie, and he won't fight any longer for the Greeks at Troy. The lie saying that he won't fight any longer for the Greeks at Troy. And he maintains that whopper to the end of the play. Achilles, we are supposed to believe, would never have acted in such a way. A defender of Cartledge's view might answer that Sophocles tuned his plays in such a way that they would appeal to an audience that strongly favored democracy, and did this for political reasons, while his actions showed that he was in fact disposed towards oligarchy. Perhaps so, but the point I've been making so far is this. The art of theater in its own nature gave Sophocles excellent reasons for staging equality and bringing down tyrants on stage. These are ideal tools for engaging and satisfying an audience. Sophocles used them well, and I think among the playwrights we know used them especially well. To show that it is the art of theater and not politics that makes theater essentially democratic, I will turn in the next section to popular plays that were developed under a tyrannical monarchy, the Tudors in England. Elizabeth I had reason to fear being overthrown. There really was a Catholic conspiracy to have her killed, and I think she had upwards of 700 Catholics killed herself. And she went on to kill many other people she thought she had reason to fear. She certainly would satisfy a common definition of a tyrant. Now, Shakespeare, writing under Elizabeth I, nevertheless illustrates some of the same democratic elements that I have been pointing out in Sophocles. So I'll say something briefly about Shakespeare. Shakespeare's kings often show their common humanity on stage. This is the element I call staging equality. And his common people often show their wisdom. This, I would argue, is due to the same theatrical necessity that drove Sophocles to the staging of equality. True, Shakespeare needed to have noble patrons, but he also needed to have a large paying audience. He needed his plays to be popular, and they were popular. One reason for this, I suggest, is that he brings royalty down to earth. He could not have done this safely for any Tudor monarch, but the Plantagenets, the family of kings that came before the Tudors, were fair game on both sides of the Wars of the Roses. Here is Richard II as he is about to be deposed. Cover your heads and mock not flesh and blood with solemn reverence. Throw away respect, tradition, form, and ceremonious duty. For you have but mistook me all this while. I live with bread like you, feel want, taste grief, need friends. Subjected thus, how can you say to me, I am a king? His ordinary humanity comes out in this moment. And then the cousin who will depose him, Henry IV, will deliver a monologue on his deathbed with the famous line, Uneasy lies the head that wears a crown, and we will see how ordinary, how human Henry is. And then we'll learn of Henry V's humanity and vulnerability in a monologue he delivers on the night before his great battle. And the last of the Plantagenet kings, Richard III, will show self-doubt before and after he's king. Here's a monologue from Henry VI, Part 3. And I, like one lost in a thorny wood that rents the thorns and is rent with the thorns, seeking a way and straying from the way. And afterwards, on the night before his death, Richard reports on the pain of the moral injury he's given himself by murdering his way to the throne. Shakespeare represents this Richard as a tyrant in language and in other ways. Now, in historical fact, Richard was no worse than the other autocrats of his period. He didn't murder anywhere near as many people as Elizabeth I. To gain or maintain power, then as now, autocrats tend to kill their enemies and their competitors, and they feel they need to kill those people. Autocracy and murder go together like love and marriage. Shakespeare misrepresents Richard on many points. He also misrepresents Machiavelli, by the way. Machiavelli held that actual good results over the long run could excuse wickedness, but not justify wickedness. He would not have approved of Richard, whose misdeeds led to no good results. Misrepresenting Richard, however, serves a theatrical purpose. Richard's moral failings were exaggerated by defenders of the Tudors in order to legitimize their rise to power for a political purpose. But Shakespeare takes advantage of that to compose a remarkably effective performance piece. In the neighborhood of a tyrant, there are many secrets, and therefore opportunities abound to play the knowledge trick, to give the audience knowledge that some characters do not have, and so to help the audience feel superior to the great people on stage. In Richard III, Shakespeare reverses the trick. Sophocles had us in the audience know things that Oedipus didn't know. But Shakespeare in Richard III gives us in the audience knowledge of what is in the mind of the tyrant, which he scrupulously keeps secret from the other characters. We in the audience know what Richard plans to do and who he plans to kill, but his victims do not until it is too late. We learn Richard's plans from the very first speech of the play, his monologue that starts with the famous line, "Now is the winter of our discontent, made glorious summer by this son of York." Later monologues bring out his self-doubt and the pain of his moral injuries. These monologues make the audience painfully close to the murderous tyrant. They turn the audience into accessories before the fact. We're, in some ways, smeared with the same guilt as Richard, as we can't help rooting for him as he commits one crime after another. But Richard III has been a very popular piece in performance, although I don't think anyone thinks it's great literature, and it's not a favorite of teachers in classrooms. Literature and theater are not the same. This play is great theater because its audiences love to hate its lead character, while at the same time the audiences enjoy a brief moral holiday as they share pleasure in his extraordinary wickedness. Later, when Richard is tormented by ghosts who remind him of the terrible things he's done. And he is stabbed with the pain of his moral injuries. The audience must feel a moral satisfaction. And of course, they feel he must fall. And they are delighted and satisfied when he goes down fighting at the end. The democratic elements in theater that I've discussed here, the silent voting, the attraction of staging equality, the excitement of seeing tyrants fall, these are natural to any theater that aims to engage a general audience. They may, in some cases, serve political purposes, but wherever they are used, they serve a theatrical purpose of engaging and holding an audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Woodruff, for a so fascinating paper that spoke also about Shakespeare theater. So a bridge to modern age and modern theater. Thank you so much. And Francesco Morosi will give a short translation in Italian for our students and Italian scholars that are here. Grazie Francesco.
Allora, l'intervento del professor Woodruff affronta uno dei temi e dei personaggi più diffusi nel teatro, cioè quello del tiranno, e parte da una considerazione certamente condivisibile, cioè i tiranni fanno un grande teatro, sono personaggi molto efficaci sulla scena, soprattutto lo è la loro sconfitta. A partire da questa indagine sulla figura del tiranno, il professor Woodruff ci ha portato dentro il teatro di Sofocle e in particolare la questione molto dibattuta sulla, diciamo, democrazia del teatro di Sofocle e sulla posizione di Sofocle stesso. Intanto appunto ci ha fatto notare alcuni elementi che sono tipici del teatro greco tutto, e poi abbiamo visto anche di un teatro, insomma, diciamo, del teatro ancora più in generale. Per prima cosa c'è naturalmente un elemento di grande democratizzazione nel fatto che il pubblico decide senza nessun vincolo che venga da nessun altro, se uno spettacolo piace oppure no, se un personaggio lo attira oppure no. Questo che il professor Woodruff ha chiamato un voto tacito del pubblico a favore o contro uno spettacolo, a favore o contro un personaggio, è un elemento di essenziale democratizzazione del teatro come esperienza. Oltretutto, diciamo, questo conduce alla necessità, in alcuni casi, di mettere in scena l'uguaglianza. Cioè, siccome il pubblico vota tacitamente, è anche il caso di fargli vedere ogni tanto personaggi che possano essere in linea con la sua stessa autorappresentazione, una parola che non abbiamo ancora usato ma che, diciamo, è un concetto abbastanza comune a queste relazioni che abbiamo sentito. I cittadini più semplici, anche quelli privi di diritti, possono essere uguali in intelligenza a chi li comanda. Terzo elemento di democratizzazione del teatro è appunto la brutta fine che fanno i tiranni. Qui il professore ha prima di tutto affrontato uno dei personaggi, anzi il personaggio di Sofocle per eccellenza, cioè Edipo in Edipo Re, sostenendo la tesi per cui Edipo sarebbe un tiranno fatto e finito. Come tutti i tiranni ha paura, come tutti i tiranni però è anche in un certo senso ammirevole, ha degli elementi di unicità. E come per tutti i tiranni, la sua caduta ha un effetto emotivo duplice, cioè da un lato un effetto di grande dolore perché siamo portati a empatizzare con lui, dall'altro però anche un elemento di soddisfazione, perché un personaggio tirannico, appunto, è vinto, è sconfitto. Questo ci porta appunto dentro il problema molto ampio sulla posizione politica di Sofocle. Era o non era a favore dell'oligarchia? La conclusione del professor Woodruff è certamente che Sofocle non fosse un fan oligarchico, perlomeno che non lo fosse il suo teatro che noi possediamo, anche perché diversi testi superstiti ci pongono davanti a tiranni che fanno brutte fini, oppure smentiscono le tesi fondamentali diciamo, di un sistema aristocratico. Prendiamo per esempio il Filottete di Sofocle, in cui appunto si dimostra che non è sufficiente essere di buona famiglia, di buona nascita per essere detti nobili. Tutto questo ci ha condotto a un affascinante confronto con un altro grande autore teatrale, cioè Shakespeare, di cui abbiamo letto insieme e discusso alcuni testi fondamentali, perché naturalmente anche Shakespeare fa molto uso del tiranno. Abbiamo letto il famoso monologo di Riccardo II nel terzo atto, quello di Enrico IV, seconda parte, poi abbiamo studiato un po' più da vicino Riccardo III. Un personaggio con cui è francamente molto difficile provare empatia, è vicino però al quale Shakespeare ci mette, perché condivide con noi, così ci ha spiegato il professore, i suoi piani, ci mette a parte dei suoi pensieri. Diciamo, non è che ci rende correi in quanto spettatori, però, come dire, crea un meccanismo che potrebbe persino essere assimilabile a quello dell'empatia. Ma, naturalmente, ci dà anche la grande soddisfazione morale di trionfare su di lui, di trionfare sul tiranno tremendo. Il pubblico ama odiare il protagonista, soprattutto se questo protagonista è moralmente e politicamente disprezzabile, e questo, diciamo, è un elemento di democratizzazione del teatro. Ecco qua.
Grazie ancora Francesco. A questo punto penso che possiamo aprire la discussione e domande in italiano o in inglese. Noi traduciamo poi per i nostri ospiti. We will translate the questions in English for our guest, current guest. Allora, passo la parola a Francesco che...
I hate keep speaking, but since no one else is doing, I have an observation for David about the freedom of movement of women. Of course, it is a completely different case because it's a comedy, but I wonder if it couldn't be of any help for your argument, which I tend to agree with, a comparison with Lysistrata, where the theme of the freedom of movement by women is explicitly thematized as the political symbol of their of Lysistrata's and all their fellow women's upheaval against male supremacy. We read in the passage from Medea the use of the verb exerche, exelthon. This same verb is also used by Lysistrata many times throughout the comedy, and it is in a way thematized. At the beginning of the play, Lysistrata and her fellow women agree on the fact that it is difficult for a woman to come out of their own, exodus, they say. So when they decide to go out, I mean, this is not a minor movement, and this is not a minor decision, because they have portrayed it as one of the most difficult things for a woman in ancient Athens. And I think this is also interesting, because when later in the play they occupy the Acropolis, they are met, of course, by the Prytanis, who wants them to stop the occupation. And he has a very puzzling line, because if we picture the staging, of course, they are within the Acropolis, and so to end their occupation, they should go out. And he says, I want to stop you going out. I want to stop your exodus. Because, he's not talking about the physical exit from the Acropolis, but he's speaking of the symbolic movement that Lysistrata and the other women make to gain their freedom. So that was just a suggestion for, broadening the scope.
Thank you. I hadn't really thought to include in the analysis, but clearly there are moves to be made. About the only thing I know about female characters in Aristophanes, and Jim will correct me if I get this wrong, is that they tend to be transgressive. And it's striking that there are 3 dramas of the 11 extant Aristophanes plays in which women not only feature quite strongly, but also have agency and show at least the potential to take on what you might call masculine roles in a political sense. In the other 8 dramas, you see women very, very little. Quite frequently, the hero of the play appears to be widowed, or you don't really hear about his wife, or he's got a couple of daughters, didn't know that. That's actually interestingly different from tragedy, which, as I said in my paper, appears to embrace the whole family. So I need to go away and think about what to do with that. But the language of Exelphon is fascinating, and I'll certainly look at it. Thank you.
Marion? Aspetta, portiamo il microfono.
Now it works. Okay, also for David Carter, I have to admit that I'm a little uncomfortable with the translation of eidos as shame or vergogna. And I think it's one of these words that we better do not translate at all. And I have the notion that it is more, right behavior than shame or anything like that. And the problem is that in our culture, we don't have an equivalent for this eidos. And as a woman, I'm very happy that we don't anymore, No, but what I'm asking you is that maybe because I have this, this notion of eidos as right behavior and not necessarily shame, I did not quite understand the contrast to time. And you said at one point, well, women, who have to show eidos are atimoi. So I do not really see this contrast, and I would like you to comment a little more on time and eidos.
Yes, that was an aside in my paper. I'm quite sure that cleverer people than me would tell me that simply to refer to eidos and time as opposites is simplification. It did help my argument a little bit to present them in that way. In another piece of work which I did some years ago and hasn't been published, I got very interested in time in the Athenian democracy. And now I'm talking about male figures, I'm talking about citizens historically. And time seemed to me have strong connotations of social standing. So hence epitemos and artimos. And so what I'm really interested in here is social standing, and therefore how you're perceived in your own society and what other people think of you. I'll take away your comment on eidos, thank you very much. I think it's still useful to my argument if it has connotations of relative social standing And if there's a sense of, well, you can't tell me what you think of this, if there's some sense of externality in the value of eidos. In other words, it's something that has to do with how other people think of you, more than, yeah. I think that's really what I'm getting at in these examples.
Non vorrei che traducessi tu, anche perché forse puoi usare parole più opportune delle mie. Professor Woodruff, io dissento credo da ogni parola che ha pronunciato, ma certamente non è che voglio opporre un'interpretazione a un'altra interpretazione. Vorrei però che fossero tenere presenti un paio di cose che mi sembrano dati di fatto. Prima cosa, nel linguaggio del V secolo, tyrannos non vuol dire quasi mai tiranno, vuol dire semplicemente sovrano. E questo. I casi in cui vuol dire tiranno sono stati per esempio studiati da Di Benedetto e limitati a un numero molto piccolo di cose. Secondo, questa una cosa meno fattuale che però ha a che fare certamente con il testo. Di Edipo si dice sempre, sia lui sia gli altri, che agisce per il bene comune e preferisce il bene comune e mette il bene comune davanti alla sua disgrazia. Io non conosco nessun altro tiranno che si comporti così.
So for Professor Woodruff, there's an intervention in Italian that I'm going to translate for you from Professor Paduano. A couple of points of dissent with your interpretation of Oedipus as a tyrant in a contemporary way of understanding the term. The first thing, Professor Paduano says that in 5th century Greek, the word tyrannos is hardly ever connoted as tyrant, but more like basileus or archon or other words like this, meaning more simply king or something like this. And the second thing about Oedipus is that Oedipus is coherently depicted throughout the play as preferring the koinon, the public good, to his own destiny. And this is quite peculiar for a tyrant. I mean, normal tyrants, such as Shakespearean tyrants, tend to prefer their own good to the communal good. This is it. There we go.
Well, let me venture an answer. I think the word tyrannos changes its valence during the 5th century. And I think this can be fairly well documented. As for in Sophocles, Clytemnestra is represented as tyrannical, and it's clearly a bad thing in the Electra of Sophocles. Agamemnon in the Ajax is represented as tyrannous, and again, that's clearly a bad thing in the Ajax. Certainly in the later plays of Sophocles, the word tyrannous does have this negative valence. The features of what I'm calling a staged tyrant are the ones I've listed for Oedipus: his susceptibility to conspiracy theory, his violent rages, his fear of being displaced. It's true that he is devoted to saving Thebes from the plague, and this is evident in the early scenes. But this is not his dominant motive. This is not why he sentences Creon to death. This is an extraordinary thing. When you think about it, he is sentencing his own brother-in-law to death for telling him and the people what he heard in Delphi. He construes Creon's actions as part of a conspiracy against him. Again, this is a part of the behavior of a stage, what I'm calling a stage tyrant, which we'll see in other cases. In Oedipus at Colonus, Creon is represented again as a stage tyrant, but without any of the good features that we see in Oedipus. Oedipus is a complex character, which is why the audience connects with him so well. He is showing not only the bad features of the stage tyrant, the suspicion, and so on, but he's also showing a devotion to the public good, and that can explain why, at the same time, the audience feels relief when he is brought down and Apollo is vindicated, and pity because a man who did have noble values has also been brought down. Whereas in the case of Creon and Oedipus at Colonus, there's no good, there doesn't appear to be any good to him at all, although he is trying to do what's right for Thebes. We don't see anything in that representation of Creon that would make us sorry if when he falls, or if he falls. There has been a debate among scholars about the extent to which Sophocles represents Oedipus as a tyrant. I think the evidence is fairly clear on my side, but I understand why there is another point of view.
Thanks. Thank you.
C'è una domanda del professor Carter.
La traduzione? Sì, no, sì, certo. I'm going to translate your answers as well. Dunque, per il professor Woodruff la parola tyrannos, diciamo, cambia valenza nel corso del V secolo. Nel teatro antico sia Clitennestra che Agamennone sono definiti tiranni, e diciamo certamente non con una buona connotazione. Naturalmente lui accetta invece sulla questione di Edipo che il dibattito è stato molto intenso e molto vasto circa appunto la definizione di Edipo. Ha posto l'accento soprattutto sulla facilità con cui Edipo è prono a credere alle teorie della cospirazione circa, diciamo, l'intervento di Creonte ai suoi danni.
Faccio come posso perché non ho voce. Su Edipo, al di là del significato del termine tyrannos, qualche riservina ce l'avrei, nel senso che buono, sì, certo, specie nella prima scena. Poi però qualche tratto tirannico ce l'ha, perché è pronto al primo sospetto ad ammazzare il cognato, è pronto solo perché crede a un complotto a far fuori metà della sua corte, e a momenti ammazza il povero pastore che non voleva svelargli la sua identità. Quindi collerico, però questi sono tratti del tiranno, collerico, pronto a uccidere, non sente ragioni e sospetta e teme. Queste sono caratteristiche del tiranno. Tra l'altro, non di quelli che ho in testa io, perché per me tiranni greci quasi non esistono. Sono tirannelli. Egisto, nel finale di Agamennone, scusa, sto parlando io. Egisto nel finale di Agamennone. Lo stesso Creonte con Antigone è debole ed è fiacco nelle motivazioni e nell'articolare il discorso. Non ce la fa. Alla fine deve dire le donne non devono prevalere. Non sa articolare un discorso. Lica in Eracle è ridicolo. È ovvio che manca a tutti i tiranni del teatro greco lo spessore, la profondità e l'odiosità del tiranno, ad esempio shakespeariano. Non c'è nessuna creatura del male nel teatro greco antico. Non c'è nessun Riccardo III, nessun Claudio di Amleto, nessun Macbeth. È tutta una... Però a me la linea che è più, diciamo, ideologico-filosofica, dell'idea che lo spettatore in fondo sia contento che il cattivo sia punito e che questo sia un godere politico perché la tirannia non gli piace e in quel modo può piuttosto, come dire, privilegiare una possibilità democratica, io a quello francamente credo.
In sostanza, in sostanza per aggiungo una cosa in appoggio alla cosa di Margherita. Certo che badiamo al solito ad Aristotele, il quale esclude che ci possano essere i personaggi centrali cattivi. Per Edipo spendo un'ultima parola. Non è pronto a credere a un fantasma, è un'elaborazione intellettuale che dipende dalla sua visione del mondo. Nella sua visione il mondo è razionale, quindi le cose inspiegabili devono essere spiegate. La congiura di Creonte è un tentativo di dare senso al mondo. Tra l'altro Villamors, con cui capita raramente di essere d'accordo, aveva risolto questa questione 150, non so quanti sono, dicendo Edipo ha torto, ma potrebbe benissimo avere ragione.
Facciamo una piccola traduzione per i nostri ospiti americani.
As I was afraid,
Il dibattito è
heated. As I was afraid, the problem of Oedipus has raised the heated debate. Margherita is in dissent with Guido, who was in dissent with Paul. So she basically tends to agree with Paul on the grounds that Oedipus' characteristics, especially his tendency to rage, are those of a tyrant. That said, Margherita also observes that tyrants in Greek tragedy are not real tyrants. They are pathetic figures at most. Aegisthus, Lycus, and even Creon in Antigone isn't able to sustain a debate with a rational debate with Antigone. I would say it is enough.
Professor Carter.
I'm going to attempt, this is a cowardly attempt to avoid attention on myself by asking the question of both of my fellow speakers. I listened in fascination to both of these talks, and what both of them did for me is they underlined the point that the poet really has to stay on the right side of his audience. And I think in Paul's words, needs to make the audience feel good about themselves. I was just wondering if there are any limits on that analysis and whether there are any difficulties for the understanding of tragedy and comedy as democratic art forms, because quite often when we think of democracy, we think about the possibility of dissent. But if we side with Plato, who's no friend of democracy, and says that the poet flatters his audience. And if we never say anything that might offend the audience, are there limits on that? Or are there in fact places in tragedy and comedy where we do put the audience on the spot, or we do think in terms of what they might be wrong or what the city might be wrong?
That's a very interesting question. Let me say something first briefly about tyranny. If you read Thucydides on tyranny, you learn that the popular view of tyrants in Athens in the later 5th century, certainly, is that they rule without regard for the rule of law. And Thucydides argues that the popular view of tyranny is wrong, that the Pisistrates, in fact, were fairly good rulers and did observe the rule of law. So clearly, by the time Thucydides is writing about the word tyrannous no longer means legitimate king, but somebody who rules outside the law, at least in popular usage. Are there limits to how far the play can go to flatter the audience? I think certainly one of Plato's objections to theater is that it is essentially democratic and flatters the audience in this way. I think there must be a limit imposed by the self-understanding of the audience itself. We do know something about our own imperfections, and of course we're deeply impressed by the impressions of the political parties to which we're opposed. So I think there obviously is a limit. One of the most important features of ancient Greek democracy was taking turns in power, the idea that no one would stay in power for very long, but that there would be an alternating, some kind of alternating system. And we also know that there was some fear in Athens of the demos acting outside the law as a tyrannus, as happened in the case of the generals at Arginusi. So I think quite a lot could be said about this. One of the charges against Oedipus, and this shows up especially in Euripides, is that he is a rabble rouser and he persuades the people to do terrible things. This is not especially flattering to the people to think that they can be manipulated by a liar such as Oedipus is represented so often in Greek tragedy. So I think there are limits, obviously, and that would be a long story to show how they are actually approached in Greek tragedy. I think more in Euripides than in Sophocles.
Did you have another question?
No,
a second question?
I was hoping to get an answer out of James. What was the question?
So many questions.
I'm so sorry. If we say that comedy and tragedy are art forms that keep the audience on side and make the audience feel good about themselves? Are there limits to that analysis, or is that always the case?
I don't think it's always the case. I guess I'm not sure I like that sort of. I'm not sure I'm really comfortable with the idea that comedy or tragedy is making an audience feel good about themselves. I don't see Oedipus as a figure of Schadenfreude. Let me say, first of all, I don't feel glad about his demise. I doubt the audience did. But that's another point. I do think comedy, on the other hand, was not in the business of ethical criticism and did not. And this is a battle I've waged a bit. I don't think it was in the business of sort of setting up people and saying, this is the popular dream. Think about it seriously. This is really awful. That's not what comedy can do, or does, or would want to do. I don't know, but I don't know if that is in any way answering the question of whether the two genres are equally or differently democratic. I guess I sort of think it's almost impossible to imagine what other kind of institutional structure or cultural system could support. Is that at all an answer?
C'era una domanda dunque di Maurizio Giangiulio, no, Marion.
Well, can I say one more thing about tyranny? I think that there's consistent. It's a very consistent word in legal terms, and I think I don't really feel there's a fundamental difference in what a tyrant is in Athenian legal culture from Solon to the end of the 5th century.
Well, just to follow up on your discussion, about tragedy and comedy. I mean, one of the obvious differences that in comedy, apparently, every part makes a very big effort to engage the public and to place them in the presence. Whereas in tragedy, of course, the figures, I mean, we call them mythical figures. They, of course, thought, they were their antecedents, but nevertheless, it's the distant past. Whereas comedy is the presence, and especially in the Arcanians, and you made a very, very powerful point. Dicaeopolis is, as you said, the prototypical Athenian, somebody, who puts it next to you. And Francesco this morning made the point clear that, when he made his Dicaeopolis, I mean, when he made his truths, it was just, an alternative, ridiculous own polis, an alternative polis. So Dicaeopolis is the prototypical Athenian. Then, of course, with the Parabasis, you always have allusions to contemporary events. And I wonder whether the choice of the Arcanians as a chorus is kind of an emphasis, on including Athenians, because the demos of Arcana, of course, it was one of these demoi that were affected by the Persian invasions, but it is also the most, the biggest demos. It's the only demos that is an entire treatise. There was not a single demos that sent as many bouloitai to the boule as Arcanae. So if you want to choose an entity of the Athenian demos that is most inclusive, but not the entire demos, you would choose Arcanae. So I wonder you know, how you would see the relationship between this fictional Dicaeopolis and the existing demos, the representatives of the Athenians that really, you know, anchored the audience in the orchestra more or less, you know, to really place the play, you know, within the lived experience and political practice of the Athenians of the 420s.
Should I just answer that in English, or try and answer it? Well, I will. I guess let me say, first of all, I think Aristophanes in particular, the people that we have in fragment form are less clear, but Aristophanes is very much a hawker of dreams, and I think and a master of conversion. I think, and he loves dressing and undressing. He's very contemporary in that sense, and he, you know, I think he's all about turning things inside out, and he loves doing that. I think the Acharnia, I think you're right. I mean, yes, that was the most populous of all the demes, as far as we know. It was also close enough that probably the percentage of people who came from that deme to that performance was higher than, you know, so what is that? Possibly even a third of the people in the audience are Acharnians. And frankly, how would they have felt about this representation of themselves? But I think I actually think they would have been delighted. It's, you know, there's no such thing as bad praise, and, you know, or what is the phrase in English? It's, you know, it's wonderful to get that kind of attention, but also they're shown and they're participating, I think, vicariously in the audience, doing a kind of conversion. And I think, and I think ultimately there's an Acharnian, though, in every Athenian, and just as there is a Lamachus and a Dicaeopolis in every Athenian, and Aristophanes is waging this battle between them that he knows is limited, that it's only for the terms of the performance, and when it's over, but there is something still there that's happened. People have done something, and I pointed out in terms of acting out, I wouldn't say equality, but acting out being equal, but acting out almost as a form of communication, where I speak to somebody and that person is as if that person could speak to me. But for comedy, it's I watch that person as if I could be watched doing what he's doing. So I think that kind of imaginary reciprocity is what comedy is doing, and what I think is fundamentally democratic about it. Did that make sense?
Yeah. Thank you. Altre domande? Other questions? Grazie. Allora, dopo questa stimolante discussione, i lavori del congresso riprendono domani mattina alle 9.
8:25, not 8.
Yeah. Con l'intervento di Francesco Morosi e Guido Paduano sulle Eumenidi, la fine del mito e l'inizio della storia. Grazie per la vostra attenzione.